Welcome back to Southeast Asia Radio. Today we'll be covering Singapore's former Transport Minister S. Iswaran's corruption case, Thailand's official legalization of same-sex marriage, and Cambodia pulling out of the Cambodia-Laos-Vietnam Development Triangle area, or the CLV-DTA project.
We'll also be covering the famous pygmy hippopotamus Mudeng. I'm Japhet.
And I'm Lauren Mai. Today is October 3rd, 2024. Prabowo Subianto's inauguration is coming up. On October 20th, Indonesia will experience a significant transition after a decade of Jokowi. But what does this all mean? Greg and Elina were joined by Ben Bland to talk about Indonesia's future under Prabowo. But before that, let's start with our headlines. So at the top of our headlines today is the internet craze over a baby pygmy hippopotamus named Mudeng from Thailand.
The first clip of Mudeng was released in late July 2024, attracting significant attention. A major turning point came when the hashtag #MudengWillBounceWhen was introduced, leading her to go viral.
I've been obsessed with all the Mudeng memes, especially the photo of her biting the zookeeper's leg.
Yep, I know that one. Big fan. Personally, I'm here for the one with the snot bubble. But because Mudeng is so popular, has there been an increase in visitors at the zoo she's in?
Yes, so around 80,000 people visited Khao Kiao Open Zoo between September 1st and 19th, during which the zoo entered a total of 12.97 million baht from ticket sales. The zoo is located in Siracha, Chonburi, which is around 2 hours away from Bangkok.
Of course, Mudeng couldn't have done it without her zookeeper. Atapon Bensnundi, the caretaker behind Mudeng's rise to global fame, was recently honored as the Zoological Park Organization of Thailand's Employee of the Month in September.
Very well deserved, and I'm very glad that the internet has put a spotlight on this endangered species. Have you seen the live stream?
I love it.
There's like a 24-hour live stream now.
24 hours?
Yeah.
I love it.
On to our next story. It covers a corruption scandal from Singapore, where corruption is rare and politicians are held to a famously high standard.
Yes, on September 24th, former Singapore Transport Minister S. Iswaran pleaded guilty to receiving gifts in office. He is the first political office holder in nearly 5 decades to be tried in court and the first minister to be tried for graft in Singapore.
The case investigates Iswaran's connections with Malaysian tycoon Ong Beng Seng and construction businessman Loom Kok Seng, who have not been charged. Mr. Ong was previously the majority shareholder of the Singapore Grand Prix, while Iswaran was the chairman of the F1 steering committee in charge of managing the Grand Prix in Singapore.
While the full details of Iswaran's relationship with these two businessmen and what he's obtained have not yet been fully exposed, investigations revealed Iswaran obtaining 10 F1 tickets in 2017, a flight on Mr. Ong's private jet, a stay at the Four Seasons in Doha to watch the World Cup finals, 14 bottles of alcohol, and a Brompton bicycle.
That's a lot. While these benefits may not seem particularly extravagant to the casual listener, to warrant the uproar that it has in Singapore, bear in mind that Singapore prides itself on its clean image, strong governance, and robust bureaucracy.
Correct. The 2023 Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index ranked Singapore the 5th least corrupt country in the world. Furthermore, Singaporean ministers are among the highest paid in the world, with annual salaries often exceeding 1 million Singapore dollars or around $750,000 precisely to discourage graft and cases like this.
Singapore's low corruption is an anomaly in the Southeast Asia region, and the country has long tried to maintain a clean governance to shore up its image as a reliable and stable financial hub for the region.
This incident is unlikely to dramatically shake up confidence in Singapore, but it may have repercussions for the upcoming general election, which is set to happen within the next year. The ruling People's Action Party is set for a challenge for its first general election since 2006 without former Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong at the helm. Let's move on to our next story. Thailand officially has legalized same-sex marriage, allowing couples to wed starting in January of next year.
That's great. Yeah, that makes Thailand the third Asian country to legalize same-sex marriage.
Yeah, Taiwan was the first when it enacted its same-sex marriage law in 2019. Second was Nepal, though full legalization is still pending.
Doesn't this also make Thailand the first Southeast Asian country to recognize same-sex marriage? How did they do it?
Yes, so Thailand is known for its acceptance and inclusivity, but despite this reputation, the LGBTQ+ community faces daily discrimination, and the government's conservative stance has made it challenging for advocates to push for change.
But what's changed over the years exactly?
The incumbent government, led by the Pheu Thai Party, has made marriage equality one of its main goals and campaigned on it during the election.
Right, I see. So now, given that the country is prided as a tourist destination, is Thailand also using same-sex marriage to attract more tourists from other countries?
Yeah, that could be the case. Many foreigners from other countries, particularly in Asia, travel to Thailand. Some even want to settle there for good because of the same-sex marriage law, which would also boost Thailand's economy.
That is interesting. It'll certainly be interesting to see how this bill impacts Thailand's economy in the long run.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, on to our last story. Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Manet recently announced on September 20th that Cambodia would be withdrawing from an economic cooperation agreement with neighboring Laos and Vietnam.
Oh, wow, hasn't that deal been in place since 2004? What caused Cambodia to pull out?
Yes, it has. So, the Cambodia-Laos-Vietnam Development Triangle Area, or CLV-DTA, was initially forged to encourage trade and development between these three countries. However, there recently have been protests and social media criticism over the deal.
Critics are concerned over land concessions and allege that the deal prioritizes foreign interests over domestic sovereignty, particularly in Cambodia's northern region, which borders Vietnam. This is a highly sensitive issue due to the historical antagonism between the two countries. Opponents to the deal have raised concerns over Cambodia potentially losing territory or control of its natural resources.
There have been protests held against the CLV-DTA in multiple countries by overseas Cambodians, including in South Korea, Japan, France, and Australia.
And what about protests in Cambodia?
Well, there have been mostly small-scale protests in Cambodia, as planned demonstrations were not able to take place due to heavy security presence in major cities across the country. The authorities have arrested around 100 people so far for protesting against the agreement, although the exact number is hard to determine.
Ultimately, Hun Manet opted to pull out of the deal as he said that the issue was being used to attack the government and to confuse the general public. It remains to be seen how the issue will be resolved, if at all.
We'll have to see. And that wraps up our headlines for today. If we missed anything you want to hear about, do write us at scaradio@csis.org, and we'll get back to you. Up next, Greg and Elina's conversation with Ben Bland. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Southeast Asia Radio. I'm Greg Poling with CSIS, joined as ever by Elina Noor of the Carnegie Endowment. Hey, Elina.
Always good to be with you, Greg.
Oh, that's so kind. And today we're joined by a repeat guest, Ben Bland. Ben is the director of the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House in the UK. Hey, Ben.
Hey, Greg. Hey, Elina. Good to be with you both.
Now, those who know Ben will be able to guess that we have him on to talk about Indonesia. We've got the inauguration of President Prabowo Subianto coming up on October 20th, which means we're ending a decade of President Jokowi's Indonesia. And Ben, among other things, wrote the book, or a book, on Jokowi, which was, I think, probably the best kind of general history, let's say, although you did it in the middle of his presidency. But a general history of the Jokowi presidency. Maybe I just give you the completely open-ended question. What are your thoughts looking ahead to this transition to Prabowo?
I think it's a really interesting time for Indonesia, of course. There haven't been that many transitions in Indonesia's modern democratic history. I think this one's going to go smoothly to begin with. And the most fascinating element of it for me is the fact that Prabowo Subianto won the election by presenting himself as a sort of proxy or successor to Jokowi. But I'm pretty confident that he's going to govern as his own man. So I think it's going to be fascinating seeing how this likely separation between these two sort of great figures of modern Indonesian politics happens, which, may not be obvious, or it may be obvious. We'll have to see. But Prabowo is someone, former Special Forces general who's been trying to make it to the top of Indonesian politics for decades. He's finally got there. I'm pretty sure, despite everything he said during the election about being there to implement Jokowi's policies, that he wants a Prabowo presidency and not a Jokowi Mark II.
We've seen a bit of an independent streak from him already with his campaign promise to implement a free breakfast or lunch, I guess now it is. And so how much more independence do you think he'll get in his governance, Ben, given that he owes a certain amount of his assent to Jokowi?
Yeah, that's right. He does owe his assent to Jokowi. Prabowo had tried to be elected many times. He was able to get a big chunk of support, maybe 45% of the electorate in Indonesia. But it was only when Jokowi, in the last 12 months or so, came behind Prabowo implicitly and never explicitly, that Prabowo was finally able to win this majority of public support. And of course, they're connected through the fact that Prabowo selected Jokowi's oldest son, Gibran, as his vice presidential candidate. So there's a formal and personal connection there, and Jokowi's son, who will be the vice president, to Prabowo. And Prabowo owes Jokowi something. But I think once he's in the presidential palace, once he has his hands on the levers of power and patronage, he'll want to govern in his own way. And that's what you would expect in any democratic system, to be honest. I think we also have to understand the complex history between these two men, that at various times they've cooperated, they've fallen out. So it wouldn't be a surprise that they cooperate and then potentially move apart from each other again. The last thing I'll say is that Jokowi has been a remarkably popular president by any democratic standards. His approval ratings are still in the kind of mid to high 70%, which for a term-limited two-term president in any democracy is amazing. But I do think once Jokowi is out of power and the focus of public and press attention and elite politics is on Prabowo, Jokowi's popularity just will be hard to translate into actual political power, in which case, why would Prabowo do things for Jokowi's benefit? He's going to govern in the way that he thinks is fit, I suspect. But, Indonesian politics is always surprising. So I think it will be up to these men and, the advisors and their cabinet and friends to decide how this all works out.
Let's keep looking back for a few more minutes before we throw dirt on Jokowi's political career. This is the end of what feels like a very transformative era. Maybe it's just because it happens to be like the decade where I worked on Southeast Asia, and so it feels fresher to me than the last couple of years of the SBY administration did. But it does seem that Jokowi will be a watershed, for good or ill, in the history of a democratic Indonesia. As you said, sky-high approval ratings and maintained for an entire decade in power. In some ways managed to kind of break the wheel of the politics, at least if you're in PDIP. How do you think Jokowi will be remembered, both as a domestic and a kind of foreign player?
I think he has been a really significant president in Indonesia, while at the same time not being a narrative president, which is interesting because most leaders try and write their own story from the start. They're obsessed with other leaders and biographies of other leaders and how to frame themselves. And Jokowi is not someone who thinks of himself in those terms. He's a very practical man as a former furniture exporter and a city mayor. He has had at home this laser-like focus on infrastructure development, on growing the economy. And he's had some successes there, some areas where he's not achieved everything that he wanted. But I think that laser-like focus at home has really marked him out from SBY. And the fact that he was able to achieve a lot when it came to infrastructure. So Indonesia now has its first metro line in Jakarta, its first high-speed railway between Jakarta and Bandung, many other airport, road, energy projects. So I think that's the kind of key domestic legacy. And I think that's part of the reason he's so popular among Indonesians. I think internationally, Jokowi embodied this strong focus on economic national self-interest in Indonesia's foreign policy. His predecessor, President Yudhoyono, and some previous Indonesian presidents had been much more a narrative leader, trying to sort of tell this story about Indonesia and trying to make sure that Indonesia had a sort of equidistance from other powers. So it didn't matter what Indonesia's path was for its own benefit, so long as it was keeping a bit of distance from the US, keeping distance from China, keeping balance. And Jokowi came in and was basically like, whoever can work with me to grow the economy and build infrastructure, I'll work with them. I don't care where that leaves us on the great powers map of the world that you look at in Washington or we look at in London. I'm just going to do what will get the economy growing, what will build the Indonesian economy, which has meant in practice more and more partnerships with Chinese companies, with Chinese SOEs, with the Chinese government. But I think Jokowi embodies the spirit of our times, really, right? Economic nationalism, foreign policy for the middle class, you'd call it, in the United States, industrial policy, a kind of pick and mix approach to the world. I'll work with whoever will benefit, my economy and my domestic interests. So I think in many ways he was ahead of his time in moving into this kind of, pick and mix, slightly chaotic, multipolar world. And in that respect, I think, he'll be seen in quite a significant way, even though he himself has never sort of set out to tell the story in that way. And nor does he really try and tell too many stories beyond saying, I want to go out and build things.
I have to say, I've ridden both the metro and the WUSH, the Jakarta to Bandung high-speed rails. I am a beneficiary from the outside of Jokowi's infrastructure policies. They've actually been quite impressive, both those rail lines. But, you spoke of this narrative, Ben. And so one of the big key projects that I think Jokowi had hoped to leave was Nusantara, of course. And Nusantara is there. It's not fully complete. Indonesia had its first cabinet meeting there. But it's not quite the grand vision that's come to life in a way that Jokowi probably meant it to be upon leaving office. How do you think that narrative of Nusantara is going to continue once Jokowi leaves office?
This has obviously been a big push from Jokowi to build a new capital city in Kalimantan in Borneo. It's a really ambitious project. I think they've set out that they need something like $30 billion of investment over the next couple of decades. And most of that is meant to come from the private sector, although it's not clear where the profits are going to be in this project. So it was always really ambitious. It was quite ill thought out. So Jokowi sort of pushed it before there was really a feasibility study or a plan. But I think he's worked quite hard to make sure, as you're saying, that at least there's some buildings there. There's a presidential office. There's the beginnings of the infrastructure, in the hope that his successors won't be able to abandon the project. I think the challenge will be, are they going to show much enthusiasm, and will they release much funding for this kind of new capital city? Will they abandon it altogether? I suspect not, because it's actually written into Indonesian law that it has to be built. They may well just slow roll it, and you might find it ends up being a back office for a few ministries, but not really kind of the core of Indonesia's kind of government and business elites. And I think it was always a weird idea, to be honest, right? I mean, Malaysia did something much smarter by building its new administrative center halfway between Kuala Lumpur and the main airport, but building a new capital city on another island 1,000 over kilometers away, not really near much infrastructure, not really near much population center, is going to be really hard to achieve. So I'm skeptical about where it goes in the long term, but clearly he's built something there. And I think the way Indonesian politics works, if Prabowo Subianto or whoever leads Indonesia in future, if they can find some benefits for them politically, economically, and the people around them, they might keep it going. But Nusantara was never going to replace Jakarta, a mega city of 30, 40, 50 million people, if you include the greater metropolitan area. So I don't think that was ever the ambition, but I suspect it'll probably be more on the disappointment side, in about 5 years' time, than it being a kind of shiny new city and an example. And from what I hear, not many Indonesian civil servants want to move there anytime soon if they can help it.
And how do we reconcile what seems like now the two Jokowis, right? We have the Jokowi, as you said, who was the pragmatist, the get things done, the small town mayor who then became, the popular Jakarta governor and focused on infrastructure and cutting red tape. And sometimes that came along with, say, some problematic tax on institutions and checks and balances. But in general, you understood what he was after. And then you have this other Jokowi, the Jokowi who envisions St. Peter's-like legacy of his own, a new capital city in the middle of the Bornean jungle. The Jokowi whose one son is going to be the vice president, but the other one is under investigation for graft related to the use of private jets. And it seems, at least, that either Jokowi or those around him in engaging in a lot of questionable politicking to get the youngest son, Kaesong, into power nearly sparked a constitutional crisis at the 11th hour, with protesters knocking down the doors of the House of Representatives in Jakarta. This doesn't seem like the pragmatist Jokowi. This seems like a Jokowi who suddenly got visions of grandeur at the 11th hour and made some costly missteps.
I'd see it a little bit differently. So sure, for people who thought that Jokowi was going to be a deeper reformer, who was going to not just focus on economic reform, but political reform and kind of keep democratization going in Indonesia. Many of those activists who are among Jokowi's strongest supporters when he first emerged on the scene before the 2014 presidential election, they are deeply disappointed with some of the things you're talking about. But to me, he hasn't actually changed that much. He's pragmatic, but he's a seat-of-the-pants pragmatist. He's not a kind of technocratic pragmatist who sort of brings in the economists and says, do the cost-benefit analysis, and let's push through the things that have the most benefit at the lowest cost. He's sort of pragmatic, but goes on his gut and his feeling. And that means some of the things he's done, probably including the capital city, don't seem to make much sense. If you're going to spend that much money, there are almost certainly better ways to spend it. When it comes to the family and politics, it's certainly disappointing. And Jokowi himself said that he would never do this. However, I think we need to highlight the context that I think every other Indonesian president, apart from maybe one who was only there for a brief while, saw their children or grandchildren follow them into politics. And if you look across the business elites, if you look across the local government elites and sort of clans and dynasties in Indonesia, that is the norm. And in fact, look across Southeast Asia, right? Once Prabowo and Jokowi's son are in power. I think at least 6 of the 10 Southeast ASEAN member states will be governed by families or children of kind of former leaders or people who are close to the top. So this is the norm across the region. I think as Jokowi amassed more and more power, he was just like, everyone else is at this. Why should I be the only one to exclude myself from a game that everyone is playing in? So I don't see it as being that different from his pragmatic approach. And in fact, he pushed for as much as he can get. When he saw there was too much resistance, for example, when there was talk that he might look to change the constitution so he could run for a 3rd term, or they might look to delay the election so he can stay in power. That seemed really unpopular with the public, and he abandoned it. Having got one son basically into the vice presidential palace, there was talk of finagling the constitution again so that his younger son could run for maybe governor of Central Java. There were these big protests that you mentioned, and Jokowi abandoned it. So I think he does remain quite pragmatic because he governs, based on his instinct. He is prone to do some things that look quite wacky to other people from time to time.
What are the chances of him being a backdoor president of sorts? I know Prabowo is a very strong personality, probably wouldn't allow too much of that to happen. But as you mentioned, Ben, he's tried finagling more time for him in power. And so with the recent lifting of the legislative cap on ministries, do you think that Prabowo's allies aside, there'll be some sort of overture to maybe extend Jokowi's influence through allies in this expanded cabinet?
I think it's definitely possible. And Jokowi would obviously, like many leaders who step down, they want to maintain influence. So to be clear, I don't think there's anything surprising or untoward about that. That's pretty normal in most political systems, to be honest. But I struggle to see how he will exert the influence, right? Jokowi, unlike a lot of other figures in Indonesian politics, doesn't currently anyway have his own political party. There's long been speculation he might seek to kind of take over a party or be inserted into one, and that would change things a bit. So he doesn't have a party to exert influence. He has his son potentially in the vice presidential office. The best guide to the powers of Indonesian vice presidents is to watch Veep, the US comedy series. It's pretty much the same game in Indonesia. Most of the vice presidents have been really weak, really hamstrung by the office. And it's very easy for a president to bog the vice president down in either kind of inane or complicated or damaging issues, which US presidents know all about too. So they don't have rivals in the vice presidential office. So I struggle to see what the kind of channels for influence would be. But having said that, lots of people around Jokowi always tell me, don't underestimate Jokowi. That's how he thrives. People always underestimate him, and he keeps kind of pulling one out of the bag somehow. So I struggle to see how, but certainly he'll be trying, and it's not beyond the realms of possibility. And I think certainly if the Prabowo government struggles on the economy potentially or other areas, and if things are looking difficult, I think, that's potentially when you'll see Jokowi trying to exert influence in different ways. But I just don't know if the public and the press will care as much about what Jokowi says or thinks or implies once he no longer has kind of the trappings of office and the command of attention the way that you do when you're the directly elected president of a nation of 275 million people.
All right, so let's talk about the guy who's actually taking power. As you said, Prabowo has been always a bridesmaid, never a bride. He's run for president twice, vice president. He was the son-in-law of the former dictator. He's finally got the big chair to himself. What do you expect?
Yeah, it's a funny one. I mean, I was in Indonesia during the election campaign, and I guess like most Indonesian elections, and maybe like many elections everywhere else, there's just not much actual policy in the campaigns, right? They have these long, they call it visi misi, vision and mission statements, but basically they just promise everything to everyone all the time. And governing is hard anywhere, and it's certainly hard in Indonesia with limited budgetary resources and a lot of bureaucratic and ministerial infighting. So it's really hard to know what Prabowo really wants to do. If there's in 5 years, there's maybe, 5 or 10 things you can really pursue, and it's not clear what those are for the most part. One potentially is the, free school meals, which Elina mentioned, which she's pushed for. And I think this is because Prabowo really identifies kind of the strength of Indonesian people as the strength of Indonesia, and he believes he's there to kind of make Indonesia strong, make Indonesia powerful. So if Indonesian kids are malnourished, which they are, and there's a lot of evidence that for a country of its level of income, Indonesia's done quite poorly in terms of child nutrition and had a lot of problems with stunting, although it has improved under Jokowi. This is something he said he wants to correct. even though it's going to cost a lot of money, I think that seems likely to be a focus. He's talked a lot in the past as a former general and former defense minister about building up the military. So you would think that would be a focus. But in his 5 years as defense minister, I don't think he massively pushed the needle. And I think he found governing quite hard there. So I think we're not really sure exactly what Prabowo is going to focus on. And I think it's common, to be honest, for a lot of people who've wanted to be president for a very long time, but that when they actually get there, they're like, okay, what am I going to do now? He's also older. He's toned down some of his more fiery nationalistic rhetoric, but we don't know if that's just a kind of campaign strategy or he's really changed the way he sees things, or he really feels a bit more balanced in how he looks at the world. So we'll have to see. But the last thing I say that I think he will definitely do, he wants to be more of a narrative foreign policy president. So he wants to have a story about Indonesia for Indonesia and for the world. And he wants Indonesia to be seen to be strong and to be respected. And, he's comfortable internationally. He speaks really good English. He grew up in Kuala Lumpur, in Zurich, and in London. He wants to go to the UN, I imagine. He wants to go to the East Asia Summit and the G20 meetings and have something to say. But whether those speeches will be substantive and will shift the needle on global issues, I'm not sure. And if you look at his 5 years as defense minister, again, the track record is mixed. He did make a lot of big speeches, but they weren't necessarily kind of followed with action, weren't necessarily well thought through or implemented afterwards.
So Jokowi skipped UNGA this year. And as you pointed out, Ben, I think we're going to see a more vocal, or at least a more expressive foreign policy from Indonesia coming from Prabowo's administration. There's a lot of speculation, of course, going on about who his cabinet will comprise, particularly in the foreign and defense ministries. Any guesses on your end?
I think it's a bit of a fool's game to guess Indonesian cabinets because they can change so often, including, at various times when I was living in Jakarta, there are ministers who are in the car on the way to the presidential palace who've been told, you're going to be minister of X. And, they're about 5 minutes away and they get another call saying, sorry, you're not going to be a minister after all. Something's come up. So I'm not going to go there. But what I would say is I just think Prabowo is going to be a much stronger figure on foreign and defense and security policy. And he's going to want to be the main spokesperson for Indonesia as a international and security actor. So I would expect that whoever is defense minister and foreign minister is going to have to work much more closely to support Prabowo's wishes. Whereas Jokowi really thought, for the most part, these things were a sort of either a tool to promote investment or a distraction from kind of the real business of governing. So I think Prabowo is really take the lead on these issues, I would expect. Yeah, and it's fascinating to say, Jokowi did speak, I think, at one or two UNGAs during COVID when it was virtual. He didn't go to the UN General Assembly once. And I think, he'd probably be quite proud of that. He's like, what's the point in flying all that way to talk to a load of kind of diplomats about nonsense? I want to get things done. So, he did go to G20s. He went to APEC. He went to forums where he thought there were kind of material benefits for Indonesia. And there was something kind of heartwarming about how clear-headed he was in what he wanted to achieve. So I think Prabowo will much more want to be the statesman. But again, does he really want to invest in the global system to kind of correct the imbalances of power that we see, the sorts of things that he's spoken about in the past? I think it's doubtful, really, whether you would see him seriously try and enact some of the things that he's talked about.
On foreign policy, I mean, I was at the Shangri-La Dialogue 2 years ago when he pitched his Ukraine peace plan, which was, I think, widely, by all accounts, it came up with, in the green room on the way out. Nobody knew that was coming. How much should we expect that kind of ad-libbing of major foreign policy? Because when people have asked me what changes, I say, well, nothing changes from Jokowi to Prabowo on day one. But if there's a crisis, right, if there's another North Natuna Sea crisis or anything else anywhere in the world, I would expect to see Prabowo take the mic. Whereas for 10 years, we've expected to see, Foreign Minister Retno take the mic, or occasionally Luhut. How does that explosiveness that has always characterized Prabowo's personality play out on a world stage?
Yeah, I think he's definitely going to look to get involved when there are issues and to speak out and, or just say, be careful what you wish for, because so many people in Australia or in America, rarely in Singapore or Malaysia, by the way, say, we want Indonesia to have a bigger role on the world stage. Let's see if that happens. Are people actually going to be happy with what that greater role is? I think we'll have to see how he plays things. But yeah, Prabowo on these kind of foreign policy questions will go with what's in his gut for the most part. I mean, I think he probably will hopefully be a bit more crafted, once he has a kind of machinery of office around him and the time and space. But I think he's still going to go with his instincts, which is going to be unpredictable. I think there's a dangerous tendency from some in Washington in particular to think, the classic, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch because he studied in America and, he speaks good English and they think he's a tough military guy they can do business with. But Prabowo, with America and with the West, he's partly a creature of the West, but he'll also never forgive America and allies for having denied him a visa in the aftermath of the ouster of Suharto when he was accused of various human rights abuses. And that's the kind of guy he is. There are certain things he likes, but he doesn't forget slights against him. So I think it's going to be a more complicated relationship than people think. But I think ostensibly Western leaders who meet him will like him because he speaks good English. He's quite charming. He's very knowledgeable and well-read. But I think if Prabowo feels that Indonesia's toes are being tread on, or Indonesia or he is being made to look bad, you will feel kind of his wrath. And we've seen that already. He penned this piece in The Economist attacking Western hypocrisy over sort of Gaza when compared to the West calling for Indonesia and others to speak out about what's going on in Ukraine. I'm not saying those things are equivalent, but Prabowo argued they were. So I think that's a sign of what we can expect. And if I was a neighbor of Indonesia's with various bilateral disputes, I think I would be somewhat concerned that if problems do crop up, it might be quite difficult to manage through some of these bilateral challenges, because I expect he will take a much tougher line potentially than Jokowi took on some of these issues.
So we're almost at time, but this is probably the most serious question that you're going to get asked about Indonesia, Ben. Now, Prabowo had this very well-crafted persona during campaigning. Do you think we're going to see his infamous dance, his Joget Gemoy, on the international stage at any point in time when he takes office?
I think he sees that the figure of fun has helped him reach new audiences in Indonesia. And Indonesia is such a social media driven country, especially for young people. And he wants to get re-elected. He wants to be popular. So I wouldn't be surprised at all the next time Indonesia hosts a summit or he's at an APEC or something and they have to wear their silly shirts. If he wants to inject a bit of dance moves, because it helps him have this different image. And, I think he also probably wants to enjoy his time in office, having spent decades, and the family and his other backers having spent hundreds of millions of US dollars probably on campaigns. Yeah. He probably wants to have a dance as well as have a rant every now and then and enjoy his time as president.
Well, it's probably the most serious answer to my very unserious question. Thank you, Ben.
Johannes Suleiman gave a much less serious answer about Prabowo. I will point out, this is not that unusual, right? Jokowi was a meme for several years. Checkered shirts, and they made a flash game about him fighting corruption when he ran for governor. Prabowo saw that memifying himself a little bit could help him to the presidency, and it clearly did.
I think it's smart. He's been active in democratic politics for a very long time. I mean, obviously, there's his track record as a general and in the alleged human rights abuses. We all know about that. But he's been learning how to be a democratic politician for a very long time indeed. So he's clearly learned how to communicate well himself and how to play things in Indonesia. So we'll have to see. But, I don't think that dancing grandpa is going to be kind of the main legacy of the Prabowo presidency, to be clear.
It is in my mind.
If it is, the question is, has he been successful or not? Well, does that mean he's kind of whitewashed his reputation, or does that mean he hasn't achieved other things? So we'll have to catch up again in 5 years' time and see.
Something tells me we're going to have more than a few Indonesia episodes in the next months and years. So, Ben, for now, thanks so much for joining us and helping to make sense of this. And Elina, thanks as always for helping me co-host.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, both.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Southeast Asia Radio. Feel free to write us with any comments, questions, or feedback at searadio@csis.org. We'll get back to you.
Do us a favor and subscribe and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever streaming platform that you listen to us on. Tell your friends about us.
Marla Hiller is our producer, and our interns are Narupat Ratanakit and Natanya Sia. Our co-hosts today were Greg Poling and Elina Noor. My name is Japhet Kitson.
And I'm Lauren Mai.
And we'll see you in 2 weeks for another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.